Saturday, April 7th, 1945, a day of desperation for the last few defenders of the Reich. In the skies above Europe, some 1,200 American heavy bombers paraded overhead en route to targets deep inside Hitler's dying Germany. On the flanks of the gigantic bomber stream, 830 P-51 and P-47 fighters stood a vigilant watch against any marauding Luftwaffe fighters. Recently, the American Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots had little to do as they weaved along with the bombers. The Luftwaffe was a shattered force, long since driven from the skies by the combined might of the American and British Air Forces. In fact, only a few German interceptor units still existed as cohesive fighter forces. All over the Reich, signs of collapse were everywhere. Wrecked aircraft littered the Luftwaffe's few remaining airfields, many destroyed on the ground before ever seeing air combat. Others sat in their revetments, their fuel tanks empty as the fuel crisis reached its climax. Few veteran pilots remained. Those pilots still with their Geschwaders were green kids with hardly any flight time. On the rare occasions they got into the air, they were massacred wholesale by the more experienced Allied pilots. On that spring Saturday in April, thousands of Germans were preparing to give up the fight. Some would stay with their units until the war ground to its inevitable end. Others were slipping away to surrender to the British or Americans, whom they knew would treat them far better than the Russians.
Some of the German pilots who fought to the end were pretty bitter as to how some of their comrades ended the war. And a case in point was a squadron commander by the name of Willy Heilmann. He was on a mission with his squadron, and he went off and landed at an airfield known to have been captured by the British. So a month before the war ended, he basically went in and surrendered by himself. The rest of the squadron and the rest of JG-26 fought on for several more weeks, and his name dropped from the official records very precipitously as a result of that. You contrast what happened to Heilmann with what happened to Erich Hartmann, who was the top ace really of all time, and his fighter group. You kind of understand why the Germans could have been a little bitter as to what Heilmann did. Hartmann's group tried to stay together. They actually got their families, and in the final days of the war, tried to get to American lines. Well, through a series of events, they ended up in the hands of a Russian tank regiment. And the Russians surrounded them with their tanks, and then through the course of a night, raped all the family members, raped the children, raped the wives and mothers of the pilots, and forced the German aviators to watch this. And during the night, several of the families later committed suicide because of what was going on, and they realized that this horror was probably going to continue. So one can understand why there was some bitterness towards what Heilmann had done.
Nevertheless, a dedicated corps of pilots remained, taking the fight to the Allies whenever the fuel situation allowed them to climb into their cockpits and get into the air. Their piecemeal, scattered attacks were at best a nuisance to the British and Americans, who by this time could throw over 15,000 aircraft against the Reich's last few hundred defenders. But the Luftwaffe was not going to give up yet. Not when they had one last secret weapon to fling at the stately formations of B-24s and B-17s that brought death and ruin to Germany's cities each day. For amid the ashes, the turmoil, and the chaos of the dying Reich, a new elite unit had been formed for one last-ditch effort to halt the bombing campaign. And on April 7, 1945, It would go into action for the first and only time in its short history. It was known as Sonderkommando Elba. Based around Stendal, the secret unit had one objective: bring down enemy bombers by any means necessary. If gunfire and rockets didn't work, the pilots had been trained to ram the four-engine behemoths. Each man vowed to destroy at least one bomber or die trying.
Colonel Gallant was against it. Even Goering was against it. Some of us rammed it out, but accidentally, but not. We were no kamikaze pilots. And our brass was against it.
We didn't hear anything particular that the Air Force had instructed their pilots to fly, not considering the danger to yourself. But you have to bring those bombers down. Unimportant how you do it, but if it has to be, you have to consider being a kamikaze. It sounded incredible initially when you heard about kamikaze being a method for Japanese. Couldn't convey that or apply that to a European human notion. But if you somehow get familiar with that idea to offer yourself as a whole and fly into something which is your object of shooting down, so be it.
The hope was that Sonderkommando Elba would cause so much damage and shock with their suicidal attacks that Americans would suspend their daylight bombing campaign. Shortly before noon, the suicide pilots took flight. From battered airstrips all around Stendal, 120 specifically modified Me-109s and FW-190s formed up into two groups and turned north. For this mission, their planes had been stripped of armor plating, some of their guns, their radio transmitters, and other equipment deemed non-essential. They would go into battle light and fast to avoid the American fighter escort, then plow their interceptors into the bombers. Most of Sonderkommando Elba's pilots had little actual flying experience. All were volunteers, but few had many hours in the air. Fewer still had received navigation instruction. To fix that shortcoming, the pilots were directed to the bomber's stream from the ground by a controller who repeatedly reminded them of the destruction the Americans had wrought on their homes. For the Luftwaffe, this would be a maximum effort. All around Germany, other tattered squadrons rose to give battle in an effort to support the Raumjägers of Sonderkommando Elba. These were the last men of the Luftwaffe, flying the last of Hitler's operational fighters. It proved to be a motley collection of old and new. Some squadrons entered the fight with war-weary Messerschmitt 109G